When Rome fell, the world's most powerful economy didn't collapse quietly. It imploded. Currencies failed, trade networks disintegrated, cities emptied, fortunes vanished almost overnight. And yet, amid invasion, inflation, and political decay, 4 assets endured when everything else was wiped out. This story begins at the height of Roman power, when the empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population and commanded the most sophisticated financial system the ancient world had ever seen. Roman money flowed through legions, ports, farms, and cities stretching from Britain to the Middle East. Taxes funded armies, coinage unified trade, stability was assumed, then war crept inward. Relentless military campaigns drained the treasury, borders hardened under pressure from external enemies. To pay soldiers and sustain control, emperors debased the currency, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals. Inflation followed. Trust eroded. Prices soared. Wages collapsed in real terms. Savings were silently destroyed. By the 3rd century, Rome was fighting wars on multiple fronts, while its economic core was hollowing out from within. The financial system that once powered the empire became a liability. Paper promises failed. State-backed currency lost credibility. Urban economies that relied on complex trade networks began to fracture. This was not a single event. It was a slow-motion economic breakdown under the stress of war. And it raises a question that still matters today. When a war-driven economy collapses, when banks fail, currencies weaken, and institutions lose legitimacy, what actually survives? History gives us a rare answer. As Rome's formal economy disintegrated, certain assets did not depend on imperial confidence, central authority, or financial intermediaries. They did not require trust in the state. They did not rely on complex markets or global trade. They held value not because Rome said they did, but because people needed them regardless of who ruled. These assets quietly became lifeboats. They preserved wealth when coins failed. They provided security when law collapsed. They remained valuable when borders shifted and emperors disappeared. Importantly, Rome's collapse was not total annihilation. It was transformation. Power decentralized, money localized, wealth changed form. And those who adapted, who held the right kinds of assets, survived the transition. This documentary is not about nostalgia or ancient trivia. It is about war and finance, and what history reveals about resilience when systems break. Because the forces that crushed Rome's economy, military overreach, currency debasement, political instability, and loss of institutional trust, are not unique to the ancient world. They are recurring patterns. And the 4 assets that survived Rome's collapse may tell us more about financial survival than any modern theory ever could. If you want to understand how wealth behaves when empires fracture, and why this ancient lesson still echoes today, subscribe now. What follows is a step-by-step reconstruction of how Rome's economy unraveled, and why only 4 assets made it through intact. The collapse of Rome's economy did not begin with a single invasion or a single emperor. It unfolded over centuries, through war, expansion, and financial decisions that slowly undermined the system from within. At its peak in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Roman Empire operated an economy of extraordinary complexity. Taxes were collected in coin, soldiers were paid regularly, long-distance trade moved grain from Egypt, silver from Spain, and luxury goods from the East. Urban life depended on stable money and predictable logistics. This stability rested on 2 pillars: military dominance and monetary trust. For generations, Rome expanded outward. Conquest brought spoils, slaves, and new tax bases. As long as expansion continued, the system worked. War paid for itself. Defeated territories financed the legions that conquered the next frontier. But expansion has limits. By the late 2nd century, Rome's borders stretched thousands of miles. Defending them required permanent standing armies rather than seasonal campaigns. Military spending became constant, not episodic. At the same time, new conquests slowed. The inflow of plunder dried up. The costs remained. The revenue did not. To bridge the gap, emperors turned inward, raising taxes, requisitioning goods, and quietly altering the currency. Silver coins that once contained nearly pure metal were gradually diluted. Each new issue looked the same, but contained less value. This allowed the state to pay its bills in the short term while pushing the cost onto the population through inflation. By the 3rd century, the strain intensified. Rome faced repeated civil wars, frequent changes in leadership, and simultaneous conflicts along multiple frontiers. Armies began backing rival emperors. Loyalty was bought, not earned. To secure power, rulers promised higher pay to soldiers, further accelerating currency debasement. Merchants responded rationally, prices rose, barter reappeared. Coins were hoarded or refused altogether. In some regions, taxes were demanded in goods rather than money because money itself could no longer be trusted. Urban centers began to hollow out. Cities that relied on complex trade networks found themselves isolated. Roads fell into disrepair. Long-distance commerce slowed. Local economies replaced imperial ones. Wealth became less visible, less liquid, and more defensive. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome's economy had fundamentally changed shape. It was no longer a unified monetary system. It was a patchwork of regional survival strategies, shaped by ongoing war and political fragmentation. This is the critical context. The assets that survived Rome's collapse did so because of these conditions, not despite them. They thrived as money failed, as institutions weakened, and as war reshaped daily life. To understand why those 4 assets endured, we first need to see how Rome's financial system stopped functioning as a system at all. That breakdown is where the real story begins. The moment Rome's economy truly broke was not when the empire lost territory. It was when money stopped functioning as trust. At first, the breakdown was subtle. Coins still circulated, markets still operated, taxes were still collected. But beneath the surface, the rules had changed. The value of currency no longer reflected the metal it contained, but the decree stamped onto it. And decrees only work when people believe in the authority issuing them. War shattered that belief. As conflicts multiplied, emperors came and went at alarming speed. Each regime needed immediate loyalty from the army. Each paid for that loyalty the same way, by minting more coins, faster, with less silver each time. What looked like continuity was actually decay. Merchants noticed first. Prices stopped making sense. A shipment of grain that cost one amount in spring could cost 3 times as much by winter. Contracts became dangerous. Long-term planning collapsed. Trade shifted from money-based exchange to negotiation, barter, and local arrangements. Then came coercion. When inflation made taxes insufficient, the state stopped asking. It began demanding goods directly. Farmers were ordered to deliver grain. Artisans were required to supply equipment, transport animals, food, clothing, all requisitioned for the war effort. This marked a critical shift. Wealth stored in abstract form, coins, promises, state obligations, became vulnerable. Wealth tied to physical control, usefulness, and local power did not. As insecurity spread, cities emptied. People fled urban centers where taxes were highest and protection weakest. The countryside became the center of survival. Economic life narrowed. Everything unnecessary disappeared. Rome's economy did not collapse into chaos. It collapsed into simplicity. Complex financial instruments failed because they required trust, enforcement, and stability. Long-distance trade failed because roads, ports, and guarantees failed. Money failed because its value depended on institutions that no longer commanded obedience everywhere at once. In this environment, only assets with 3 characteristics survived. They were independent of central authority. They were immediately useful. They could be defended or controlled locally. Anything else, no matter how sophisticated, official, or once powerful, became fragile. This is where the historical record becomes revealing. Archaeology, legal codes, and surviving accounts all show the same pattern. As Rome's formal economy disintegrated, wealth did not vanish. It changed form. People abandoned failing structures and concentrated value into assets that functioned even when law, currency, and borders did not. Those assets were not chosen because people predicted collapse. They were chosen because, under pressure, they simply worked. The next section identifies the first of those survivors and explains why it outlasted imperial money, imperial authority, and imperial war. The first asset to survive Rome's economic collapse was the most fundamental one and the most revealing. Land. Not land as speculation. Not land as abstract ownership recorded in distant archives, but land as control over food, labor, and security. As Rome's monetary system unraveled, land quietly replaced money as the primary store of wealth. This shift was not ideological, it was practical. When coins lost credibility and markets fractured, the ability to produce food became the ultimate form of financial resilience. War made this unavoidable. Armies still needed to eat. Cities still depended on grain. Even when imperial authority weakened, land continued to produce value every season. Unlike currency, it could not be debased. Unlike trade goods, it did not require stable routes. And unlike urban wealth, it could be defended locally. This is why Rome's economic center of gravity moved out of the cities and into the countryside. Large estates, latifundia, expanded as small farmers collapsed or sold under pressure. Wealth consolidated not because elites were visionary, but because land was one of the few assets that still worked under constant war. Taxes were increasingly assessed in kind. Power followed production. Those who controlled land controlled survival. This marked a profound transformation. Under the empire's peak, wealth was mobile. Money flowed. Trade connected distant regions. During collapse, wealth became immobile, rooted, defensive, local. Landowners were not immune to war, but they were adaptable. They could negotiate directly with military commanders. They could supply armies and gain protection. They could shelter populations when cities became liabilities. Most importantly, they could feed themselves when markets failed. Contrast this with urban wealth. Urban elites, who held riches in coin, contracts, or state-backed positions, found themselves exposed. When imperial enforcement weakened, their claims lost meaning. You cannot eat a title. You cannot defend a ledger. And in a collapsing system, legal ownership without physical control is fragile. Land reversed that equation. Ownership mattered less than possession. Authority mattered less than proximity. What counted was who could hold territory, work it, and protect it. Over time, this dynamic reshaped Roman society itself. The economy shifted from a market-based imperial model to a localized agrarian one. Power fragmented. Wealth became hereditary, tied to land rather than currency. This was not progress or regression. It was adaptation. And it explains why land endured when Rome's financial system did not. Land did not rely on imperial trust. It did not require stable money. It did not disappear when institutions failed. It functioned in war because war could not eliminate the need for food. But land was not the only asset that survived. Another form of value endured alongside it, smaller, more portable, and equally revealing about how people adapt when empires fracture. That is where we turn next. The second asset that survived Rome's economic collapse was precious metal held outside the state system. Not currency, not officially stamped coins, but metal valued for what it was, by weight, not by decree. As Rome debased its coinage, people learned a hard lesson. The stamp of the empire no longer guaranteed value. What mattered was the material itself. Silver and gold stopped functioning as money and reverted to something older and more durable, portable stores of trust. This transition happened quietly. Coins were clipped, melted, hidden, or traded at discounts based on purity. Hoards buried during the 3rd and 4th centuries show a clear pattern. People saved older, higher quality coins and discarded newer issues. The public did not debate monetary theory. They simply responded to incentives. War accelerated this behavior. When armies moved through a region, wealth needed to be mobile. Land could not move. Livestock was visible and vulnerable. But small amounts of high-value metal could be concealed, transported, or buried. In an era of invasion and instability, portability became protection. This is why archaeological records from late Roman territories are filled with hidden hoards. These were not investments, they were insurance. People buried metal not to speculate, but to survive displacement. Some never returned to recover it. Others did, and used it to restart life under new rulers, new borders, and new systems. Crucially, precious metals did not depend on Roman authority. They retained value whether the emperor changed, whether taxes were collected, or whether the region was ruled by Rome, a rival power, or no centralized authority at all. They crossed political boundaries when institutions could not. However, metals had limits. They did not produce food. They did not provide protection. They did not create community. They preserved value, but they did not sustain life on their own. This is why metal wealth often complemented land ownership rather than replacing it. Land provided stability, metal provided flexibility. Together, they allowed families to navigate chaos, anchored locally, but capable of movement if conditions deteriorated. Contrast this with paper claims and financial promises. Debts owed by the state were erased. Contracts lost enforceability. Pensions disappeared. Anything that required institutional continuity failed. Metal did not. It required no court to validate it, no army to enforce it, no trust beyond recognition of scarcity. This is the deeper lesson. In collapsing systems, value shifts from symbolic trust to material reality. The more abstract an asset is, the more it depends on institutions. The more physical and widely recognized it is, the more likely it is to endure fragmentation. But Rome's survivors did not rely on land and metal alone. A third asset endured, one that rarely appears on balance sheets, but repeatedly determines who survives periods of systemic stress. That is where we turn next.